You walked out of a valley that statistically should have catalogued your broken pieces as evidence of its destructive capacity, yet here you stand with sharper discernment, calmer presence, and more functional decision-making architecture than before the collapse. This recovery pattern violates every documented protocol for trauma response because prolonged exposure to chronic betrayal, systematic isolation, and coordinated psychological warfare should fragment your cognitive processing, lower your confidence thresholds, and trap you permanently in survival mode reflexes. The monitoring entities assigned to document your deterioration sent back reports that confused their operations because you didn't collapse according to their timeline predictions. You adapted, you observed, you reconstructed yourself using the very pressure meant to pulverize you into controllable dust. This isn't the resilience narrative sold in self-help content. This is immunity. This is evidence that certain anointed vessels carry a divine incompatibility with destruction that makes them indigestible to the darkness attempting to harvest their frequency. The narcissistic operatives surrounding your journey expected pressure to make you smaller, easier to manipulate, desperate enough to accept crumbs of validation from people who spent years poisoning your perception of reality. They invested considerable energy into gaslighting operations designed to convince you that your accurate reading of their contempt was paranoia, that your legitimate boundaries were unreasonable demands, that your spiritual authority was delusion requiring medication. Every smirking dismissal you endured wasn't random cruelty. Every strategic betrayal timed to maximize emotional damage wasn't coincidental meanness. Every stolen idea repackaged as someone else's innovation wasn't simple plagiarism. These were precision strikes aimed at fragmenting your identity construct because the enemy needed you to question your own mind, to doubt your spiritual perception, to believe the lies about your worthlessness that would open the portal they required to complete the harvesting operation they had mapped onto your timeline. But you didn't cooperate with your own destruction. At some point during the deepest pressure, when every logical indicator suggested surrender, you shifted from asking why this was happening to you and started observing how it was happening, cataloging enemy patterns like a scientist documenting battlefield mechanics. That is why in the trilogy, The Three Keys to a Prosperous Life, the link is in the pinned comment, I explain how this cognitive shift from victim consciousness to analyst frequency changes the entire spiritual warfare dynamic in ways that terrify monitoring entities because they lose their primary weapon, which is your emotional implosion. When you stopped feeding them reaction material and started treating pain as intelligence-gathering data, you transformed suffering into strategic advantage that made you progressively harder to touch with each failed attack attempt. This pattern of conversion, where wounds become wisdom and chaos becomes research material, represents how chosen ones survive what kills ordinary consciousness. Not through pretending everything is fine, but through ruthless acceptance of reality, combined with relentless strategic adaptation that rebuilds you with patches over every entry point the enemy previously exploited. The spiritual courtroom dimension operating behind your valley experience reveals why your recovery appears unhuman to observers who expected you to stay broken. In the unseen realms, a legal case was being constructed against you by monitoring spirits who documented every moment of weakness, every tear shed in isolation, every doubt whispered in the darkest hours as evidence that you had forfeited your divine assignment through failure to maintain perfect faith under impossible conditions. They needed proof that the anointing on your life had been successfully stolen, that your frequency could be replaced with their lower vibration signature, that your timeline could be hijacked to serve their territorial agenda of harvesting chosen vessels before they reach operational maturity. But the courtroom proceedings encountered an unexpected obstacle that disrupted their entire case strategy. You kept showing up. Not perfectly, not heroically, not with the triumphant declarations they could mock as false bravado. You showed up broken, confused, barely functional on days when breathing felt like work, but you showed up. That stubborn existence, that insistence on continuing, despite having every logical reason to disappear, created a legal defense the enemy couldn't overcome, because persistence under impossible conditions carries more weight in divine courts than perfect performance under favorable circumstances. The divine promotion system for chosen ones operates on inverted logic that confuses both narcissistic entities and well-meaning humans who assume advancement comes from visible success, strategic networking, or lucky breaks that position you in front of the right opportunities. The true promotion system functions through valley survival metrics, where the depth of your descent determines the height of your ascension, where the intensity of warfare you endured without breaking certifies your capacity for next-level assignments that require someone who cannot be intimidated by darkness because they've already walked through its deepest concentration and emerged with their core frequency intact. Every narcissist who targeted you, every monitoring spirit who tracked your movements waiting for collapse, every hidden enemy who celebrated your apparent downfall was unknowingly participating in your qualification process, because the oil of anointing that makes you a target in the valley also makes you untouchable once refined through pressure that was meant to steal your light, but instead polished it into something sharper, clearer, more focused than before the attack sequence began. Your empathy underwent a dangerous evolutionary transformation that narcissistic entities didn't anticipate in their battle plan, because they assumed prolonged exposure to betrayal would either harden you into bitterness or leave you trapped in naive compassion they could continue exploiting. Before the valley, your empathy operated indiscriminately with open frequency that gave trust, energy, and access to anyone who appeared wounded or in need of your healing gifts. This represented a massive vulnerability the enemy mapped and weaponized by sending agents disguised as victims who required your spiritual support, then turned your compassion against you by claiming you weren't giving enough, caring enough, or understanding their complex pain patterns enough to justify their contempt for your boundaries. This is the empathy trap, designed to convert your greatest strength into the mechanism of your destruction by making you believe that authentic love requires tolerating abuse, that true spirituality demands accepting disrespect, that evolved consciousness means letting people harvest your energy without consequence. The valley burned that naivety out of your operating system, not by killing your capacity to feel deeply, but by teaching you to read the energetic signature beneath someone's words, to detect manipulation before it fully manifests in behavioral patterns, to recognize narcissistic frequency even when wrapped in spiritual language or elaborate victim narratives designed to bypass your discernment protocols. The silence protocol you developed disrupts enemy operations more effectively than any confrontation strategy could, because narcissistic entities feed on reaction as their primary fuel source. Your anger fuels them. Your defense gives them material to twist. Your explanation provides ammunition they repackage as evidence of your instability. Your tears open energetic portals they access for continued harassment and frequency theft operations. Each emotional response you provide creates a doorway they mapped for sustained access to your energy field, which is why they invest so much effort into provoking reactions through calculated insults, strategic provocations, and elaborate setups designed to make you explode, so they can point to your explosion as proof of the crazy narrative they've been building about you to mutual connections. When you stopped giving them material to work with, when you became comfortable being misunderstood rather than compulsively explaining yourself to people who had no intention of understanding, you closed every access point they had spent years mapping onto your response patterns. Silence isn't weakness in spiritual warfare dynamics. It's weaponized boundary enforcement that operates at a frequency narcissistic entities cannot access, cannot decode, cannot manipulate because it refuses to enter their game board. The eagle doesn't debate with crows about flight mechanics. It simply flies at an altitude crows cannot reach, demonstrating superiority through operational capacity rather than verbal argumentation. Your relationship with solitude transformed from punishment into strategic advantage in ways that reverse the enemy's isolation tactic, because most people fear being alone since it forces confrontation with their own thoughts, their unresolved pain, their authentic self, beneath the social masks they wear to gain acceptance from groups that wouldn't recognize their value if they showed up completely honest. Narcissistic entities exploit this fear by isolating targets as punishment, assuming loneliness will drive them back into toxic connections out of desperation for any human contact, even if that contact comes wrapped in contempt and conditional approval. You reverse their tactic entirely by converting the isolation they meant as torture into your training ground for self-sufficiency that makes you ungovernable. In solitude, you learn to validate yourself without external approval mechanisms, to trust your discernment without requiring consensus reality to confirm what you're seeing, to build plans without group permission or committee approval from people who don't carry your vision clarity. This independence represents their worst nightmare because you cannot be controlled through social pressure, cannot be manipulated through fear of abandonment, cannot be harvested through loneliness, induced desperation that makes people accept crumbs of attention from sources that despise them. The Valley forced you into solitude as an attack vector meant to break your spirit through isolation trauma. You converted it into an impenetrable fortress where you rebuilt your entire operating system without interference from narcissistic programmers attempting to install their malware into your decision-making architecture. The chase dream sequence where you're running without moving reveals the spiritual mechanics of valley pressure, because this recurring nightmare pattern represents how narcissistic entities trap chosen ones in psychological loops designed to create helplessness programming. In the dream, you're fleeing from a threat you cannot see clearly, running through thick atmosphere that resists your movement like swimming through concrete, screaming for help that produces no sound because your voice has been stolen by the same force pursuing you through dark corridors where every door leads back to the starting point. You wake up with your heart racing, chest tight, convinced something terrible almost caught you, even though the details dissolve the moment you open your eyes. This isn't random sleep disturbance. This is spiritual warfare targeting your subconscious programming to install belief systems about your powerlessness, your inability to escape, your isolation from help that would reinforce waking life patterns of learned helplessness. The enemy needs you to accept as permanent reality. The chase dream operates as nocturnal gaslighting, where your own mind becomes the weapon used against you, generating fear about threats you cannot identify or defend against, because the real threat isn't the shadow pursuing you through dream architecture. The real threat is the helplessness belief being installed while your conscious defenses are lowered during sleep cycles, when narcissistic entities have easier access to your subconscious programming systems. Every morning you woke from this dream, carrying residual anxiety into your day, represented a successful attack on your confidence infrastructure, because the dream trained you to expect pursuit, to anticipate threats from behind, to believe escape is impossible, even when you're running at full capacity. This programming was meant to make you hesitate in waking life, to second-guess your ability to outmaneuver enemies, to accept that some forces are too powerful to resist, so you might as well stop trying to break free from the valley's gravitational pull on your timeline. The poisoned compliment phenomenon you experienced represents one of the most sophisticated psychological warfare tactics narcissistic operatives deploy because it bypasses your defense systems by approaching through the compliment door rather than the obvious insult pathway you've learned to block. Someone approaches with apparent warmth, praising something about you with words that should feel affirming, but the delivery carries a micro-expression of contempt that your nervous system registers before your conscious mind can process the contradiction. They tell you your work is impressive for someone without formal training, that your appearance looks better than usual today, that your ideas are interesting even if they're not practical for real-world application, that your spiritual sensitivity is admirable, though perhaps a bit too intense for most people to handle comfortably. Each statement contains a compliment wrapped around an insult designed to confuse your response mechanisms. Because if you react to the hidden insult, they point to the surface compliment as evidence you're paranoid and ungrateful for their kindness. If you accept the compliment, you've swallowed the poison pill of inadequacy they embedded in the praise structure. This tactic works by exploiting your desire to believe people mean well, your hope that this time the kindness might be genuine, your exhaustion from constantly defending against obvious attacks that makes you lower your guard when someone approaches with apparent warmth. The poisoned compliment operates as a delivery system for worthlessness programming, disguised as encouragement, planting seeds of doubt about your capabilities while maintaining plausible deniability about their true intention. You spent years trying to figure out why these interactions left you feeling diminished rather than uplifted, questioning whether you were too sensitive or reading malice into innocent statements, until you learned to trust the feeling in your body over the words in your ears, because your nervous system never lies about contempt, even when social conditioning tells you to ignore the warning signals your intuition sends about people whose words don't match their energetic signature. The blatant copy operation, where someone steals your creative work, your strategic approach, your unique perspective and repackages it as their own innovation, reveals the identity theft dimension of narcissistic warfare, because these entities don't just want to defeat you. They want to become you, to wear your frequency like a costume they can use, to access opportunities meant for your timeline, while you watch from the sidelines, stripped of credit for your own creative output. You poured energy into developing a concept, refining an approach, articulating a vision that emerged from your unique combination of experience, insight, and spiritual download. You shared it in conversation with someone you thought was a peer or collaborator, explaining the mechanics with the generosity that comes from believing knowledge should be freely exchanged among people working towards similar goals. Days or weeks later, you watch that person present your concept to an audience as their original thinking, using your exact language, your specific examples, your structural framework, without acknowledging where they acquired this sudden burst of insight that sounds remarkably similar to the conversation you had when they were asking you to explain your process in detail. The theft goes beyond intellectual property violation. It's spiritual identity theft designed to convince you that your originality holds no value since anyone can copy and claim it, that your unique voice can be easily replicated by people with better marketing platforms, that your purpose can be hijacked by those with fewer ethics and more strategic positioning. The blatant nature of the copy operation adds insult to theft because they're not even attempting subtlety, not bothering to disguise the source material, demonstrating such contempt for your power that they assume you'll either fail to notice or lack the courage to call them out publicly. This represents a test of your boundaries, a probe to determine whether you'll defend your creative territory or accept being harvested as a content generator for people who lack the depth to produce original material but possess the shamelessness to steal from those who can. When you finally recognized the pattern and understood these weren't isolated incidents, but coordinated identity theft operations, You stopped sharing your best material with people who hadn't earned access to your frequency through demonstrated integrity rather than surface-level spiritual language that masks harvesting intentions beneath collaborative vocabulary. The sleep paralysis phenomenon, where you wake unable to move with crushing weight on your chest, represents direct spiritual attack rather than medical sleep disorder, because the sensation includes elements that transcend physiological explanation into supernatural oppression territory. You regain partial consciousness while still trapped in the border state between sleep and waking, aware of your physical surroundings, but unable to move your body or call for help despite desperate effort to break free from whatever force holds you immobilized against your bed. The pressure on your chest makes breathing difficult, creating panic that amplifies your helplessness as you struggle against invisible restraints that tighten the more you resist. Sometimes you sense a presence in the room watching with malevolent satisfaction, a dark figure at the edge of your vision that dissolves when you finally break free and sit up gasping for air in your now empty bedroom. The medical explanation attributes this to disrupted REM cycles, where your brain wakes before your body's natural paralysis during dreaming dissipates, a timing malfunction in your sleep architecture that creates temporary but harmless immobility. But this explanation fails to address why the experience carries such profound terror, why you feel attacked rather than merely confused, why the weight on your chest feels intentional rather than random muscle inhibition, why certain life periods marked by spiritual breakthrough correlate with increased frequency of these episodes. Sleep paralysis serves as nocturnal warfare, where monitoring spirits attempt to terrorize you during vulnerable states, to remind you they have access to your consciousness even in supposed safety of your own bed, to plant fear about sleeping that would deprive you of rest needed for next day's spiritual assignments. The crushing weight represents their attempt to suffocate your breath, your voice, your capacity to speak truth that exposes their operations. The immobility programming trains you to accept powerlessness as your permanent condition, to believe you cannot move against forces holding you in place regardless of your will to break free. Every episode, you survived without surrendering to permanent fear of sleep represented a victory in nocturnal warfare, because you continued resting despite their attempts to turn your bedroom into a battlefield, refusing to let their intimidation tactics rob you of the restoration required for continuing your valley walk, without collapsing into the exhaustion they needed to fragment your decision-making capacity. The burnt bulb phenomenon, where electrical equipment malfunctions in your presence during high-stress periods, reveals how your energetic frequency affects physical environment when under sustained spiritual warfare, because light bulbs blow out when you enter rooms, electronics glitch without technical explanation, devices drain faster than normal usage patterns would predict. You walk into your home after a particularly brutal day of psychological warfare, and every light fixture you approach flickers then dies, forcing you to replace bulbs that should have lasted months but somehow burned out the moment your elevated frequency entered their field. Your phone battery drains from full charge to 15% during a 2-hour period when you weren't actively using it, as if something was feeding off the energy stored in your device. Your computer crashes randomly during important work sessions, losing unsaved material that requires hours to reconstruct, creating frustration that feels less like technical malfunction and more like deliberate sabotage from sources you cannot identify or confront. The rational mind wants to attribute these events to coincidence, to normal equipment failure that everyone experiences occasionally, to confirmation bias that makes you notice technical problems more during stressful periods when you're already feeling targeted. But the pattern persists with statistically improbable frequency, clustering around moments when your spiritual assignments are accelerating, or when you're receiving downloads that would advance your understanding of enemy operations. The electrical interference represents the physical manifestation of spiritual warfare bleeding into material reality because your elevated frequency during battle conditions affects electromagnetic fields in ways that standard physics cannot fully explain. Monitoring spirits attempting to drain your energy create disturbances in electronic devices that operate on similar frequency bands, generating malfunctions designed to frustrate you, to waste your time on technical troubleshooting, to make you question whether you're somehow causing these problems through your own electromagnetic instability. The burnt bulb pattern serves as visible evidence of invisible warfare, physical proof that something beyond normal stress is affecting your environment in measurable ways that cannot be dismissed as imagination or paranoia. When you stop trying to rationally explain away the pattern and simply accepted that your frequency disrupts certain electronic equipment during warfare seasons, you removed the gaslighting element from the experience and converted it into confirmation that spiritual battle was intensifying around assignments the enemy wanted to prevent you from completing. The silence in the room when you speak truth represents the most validating and simultaneously isolating experience in spiritual warfare because you articulate something profound, accurate, or revelatory about the dynamics playing out in a group setting, and instead of generating discussion or acknowledgement, your words land in dense silence that feels like physical substance rather than mere absence of sound. Everyone suddenly becomes fascinated with their phones, their drinks, the patterns in the carpet, anything that allows them to avoid eye contact with you after you've just named something they all felt but no one wanted voiced. The silence stretches for seconds that feel like minutes, thick with discomfort that isn't about what you said being wrong, but about it being too right, too exposing, too dangerous to acknowledge without forcing everyone to confront truths they've been collectively avoiding. Then someone changes the subject with aggressive cheerfulness, steering conversation towards safe topics that allow the group to pretend your observation never happened, erasing your contribution from the record through strategic amnesia that leaves you questioning whether you actually spoke or if the words only happened in your mind. This pattern repeats across different settings with different people, creating a through line of invalidation where your most accurate observations generate the strongest resistance disguised as polite silence that refuses to engage with substance while maintaining social niceness that makes you look unstable if you push for acknowledgement. The silence reveals who carries demonic assignments to suppress truth even when they have no conscious awareness of serving that function, because demons react to light by creating dead space around it, attempting to isolate the truth speaker so others won't be contaminated by dangerous accuracy that threatens the comfortable lies everyone has agreed to maintain. You learn to read the silence as confirmation rather than rejection, understanding that the depth of avoidance corresponds to the accuracy of what you named. That profound silence means you struck something true enough to terrify the false peace everyone was protecting. The unexpected betrayal from someone positioned as close ally reveals the Judas protocol embedded in spiritual warfare, because the enemy doesn't just attack from obvious opposition, but plants operatives in your inner circle who gain trust over extended time periods before executing their true assignment at the moment of maximum damage potential. This person spent months or years building relationship with you, offering support during difficult seasons, speaking language that suggested they understood your vision and wanted to help you achieve it, positioning themselves as the loyal friend you could trust when everyone else proved unreliable. You shared vulnerable information with them, strategic plans you were developing, fears you carried about other people's intentions, giving them detailed maps of your internal landscape because you believed their care was genuine based on sustained investment that seemed too elaborate to be performance. Then came the moment when you needed them most, when you were under attack from multiple directions and reached out for the support they had promised would always be available, and they vanished, or worse, They joined the attackers with information you had shared in confidence, now weaponized against you in public forums, where your private struggles became entertainment for people who hated you. The betrayal carries extra devastation because you didn't see it coming from this source, didn't have defenses prepared against someone you had welcomed past your boundaries through demonstrated trustworthiness that turned out to be elaborate pretense. The Judas figure operates as the enemy's most effective weapon because betrayal from strangers cannot wound you at core identity level the way betrayal from supposed friends can. Because you expect opposition from people who openly dislike you, but you don't expect assassination from people who claim to love you. The spiritual purpose of the Judas Protocol is to make you trust no one, to convince you that genuine connection is impossible because anyone can be a planted operative regardless of how long they've maintained their cover, to isolate you through fear of future betrayal rather than through actual lack of trustworthy people. You survived this by learning that the Judas betrayal served to expose who was never really for you, despite appearances, that their departure cleared space for genuine alliances that didn't require the exhausting vigilance needed around people performing loyalty while planning exit strategies, that some relationships are meant to end explosively so you finally see what was always there beneath the mask they showed you. The reacting animal pattern, where dogs bark aggressively at people, you're trying to give benefit of the doubt, reveals how animals